Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another tournament. Today we are going to finally be covering the Canadian Open. This is my first time playing in the Canadian Open. This is from 2022. And let's get into it. Round 1, I am playing with the white pieces against Yuhei, who is 2200. And I believe has several norms for National Master, so I'm dealing with a tough opponent on the very first round. I start with d4. Yuhei plays d5. We see c4, e6, knight to c3, c6, and now I play knight to f3. I'm begging and pleading for a knight to f6. Because if we can get into lines that I know well with positions like this, then I'm quite happy. But I don't get spared such a thing. Yuhei takes on c4, and this is something I wasn't really fully prepared for. I understood that generally in these positions there should be enough compensation, even if I fully lose the pawn. But that was kind of a worst case scenario for me. I didn't want to lose the pawn, but I didn't exactly know how to get it back. This is one of the biggest problems I had switching to d4 with such little preparation. A way to avoid this even is way back here after c6. I could totally just play e3 here. This just avoids any of these problems because now I can just take back immediately. But that's not what happened here. So after e3, attacking the pawn, Yuhei tries to keep it with b5. I play a4. This is a natural looking move, essentially just trying to undermine the structure. If b4, we can play knight a2, and c4 will fall. So we're not really too concerned here. And other than that, there's bishop b4, which is something I just wasn't prepared for again. This is actually just a main line. This is something I should have known. Bishop d2 is the main move here. What we'll see generally is a5, a takes b5, bishop takes c3, because if they take back, then knight takes b5. So they take, bishop takes, c takes, and this funky move b3. But it turns out that we're totally okay here, as long as we remember that, well, b4 isn't really possible here. If it was, it would be very scary, but b4, we can take it with the bishop. And what they should do is just play bishop to b7. We can take and play bishop b2. The game goes on. It's a messy position, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. And this is clearly what my opponent wanted. But I didn't really know these plans. I ended up in this position going for knight e5. And the idea was, I understood that in some Catalan positions, this knight e5 move could be played. So I also had ideas of a potential queen to f3, which doesn't really do anything, but that was just something that was on my mind. Knight f6, I played g3 here, because queen f3 doesn't really make any more sense. Queen f3 is like a one, like, it's hard to allow it anyways, but it's aimed with the idea of attacking both squares at once, but they can always just cover everything with queen c7 at the very worst case scenario. But okay, I play g3. Going into what I'm trying to do is like a Catalan position, where I'm just going to try to argue that I have compensation on the long diagonal. This isn't awful for me yet. There's some compensation. It's not the most enjoyable position to play, but it's not by any means like lost or anything. Knight d5 was played. Queen to c2. Now we see bishop to b7, very natural move, trying to oppose my bishop on g2. Castles, a6, and rook d1. So one thing is, I'd never really want to take on b5, because this justifies their whole plan. I want them to take on a4. If they ever take on a4, I am never scared here. So let's just say they take on a4 here. I just take back. Now c4 is weak and c6 is weak. This is just a horrible situation for black here. I'm going to be getting my pawn back at some point, because I believe I am currently still down one. But it does not matter. These pawns are very weak on the queen side, so that gives us good play. Of course, again, doesn't happen. A6 is played. Now I play rook d1, trying to oppose their queen. Knight to d7, and now I play e4. Again, this is all totally fine. The whole point of e4 here is if knight takes e5, which might look tempting, there's d takes e5, and all of a sudden this knight is kind of stuck and will be lost. So knight e7 was played, and then I ended up playing knight a2 to kick their bishop. Bishop d6, and I played knight f3 here, which isn't correct. Turns out knight takes d7 offers some promising positions. Queen takes d7, bishop e3, best move is a5, knight c3, and bishop back to b4. And we can get a position like this with knight e2, where there's a lot of pressure on the queen side, and we have a relatively covered center for the moment, so we don't really have to worry. This tension could favor us, sometimes maybe it doesn't, but generally they're never ever threatening to take on a4, but we're always potentially threatening to take on b5 with some sort of e5 even maybe, but yeah, like this is definitely probably slightly better for black, but there's not really anything like horribly wrong for white either, even though we're down a pawn. It feels like we have at least a little bit of compensation here. So that's important. And I think mainly it has to do with this knight on e7. It's not really that strong. It doesn't have a good route to get into the game. All right. So I played knight f3. Very natural move, trying to keep pieces on the board where I feel like I have at least a little bit of space. But this isn't really the right approach, because now knight g6 comes. I played h4, trying to kick their knight. They play h6. I play h5, of course, because I want to kick their knight. But this isn't really that awful for them, surprisingly. Even though there's a pawn on h5, it feels like I have a lot of space now. The pawn could always easily be weak to some sort of knight f6 in the future. It's not quite possible yet, because knight f6 immediately runs into e5, which loses the game. But it's something to keep in mind that this pawn could be weak in the future. I played bishop to e3. My opponent ended up playing f5 here. So actually, f5's a huge deal, and I should have played e5 instead. This is important, because now f5 is a little bit less comfortable to get in. Because after f5 and e5 now, the difference is I don't get to take en passant, and I don't really want to take here either, I believe. This isn't really so great for us. I think the first thing I'm going to look at is knight takes f5. This looks very reasonable for black, even though they have the weak e6 pawn. Again, it is important to remember they are up a pawn, but now d4 becomes extremely weak, and this knight on f5 is really nice. Even still, we can just look at things in terms of e takes f5 and e takes f5, which also doesn't look that bad either. It feels like f4 is in the air, and this is probably just the stronger of the two moves, because f4 will start attacking us on the king side, so that looks like a problem. But alright, I played e5 here, bishop c7, and then queen d2. So I have ideas of sacrificing on h6. Queen e8 was played, and I took on h6. The whole point is, if they take, then I can take. And this is actually quite reasonable, because if they go in, I always have knight g5, and then I can take on e6. This looks like a total mess, but it looks like white is actually coming ahead here. So this is a bit of a problem. But that's why queen takes h5 was played instead, which is a good move. And here I made a mistake, and I didn't understand immediately why it was a mistake. It looked like there's two equally good moves. So we have to move the bishop, obviously, but where do we move it? I was thinking g5, but the problem is the bishop on g5 kind of gets stuck, and bishop f4 is much stronger because preventing future f4s and knight f5s is extremely more important than having something, well, most specifically the bishop. Having the bishop on g5 isn't really that effective. And how the game could go is rook fb8. Surprisingly, this is like one of the only moves to kind of maintain a slight edge. But of course, you can just look up moves like knight g5, and this feels pretty okay if you ask me. And if rook ab8, knight g5 is actually just a huge problem, and this is actually quite different. So like rook ab8, I think white's already significantly better. But okay, I played bishop g5. Missing that, the knight is just much better on g5. I mean, that's not like such a ridiculous thing. Of course, the knight feels better on g5, but I didn't know exactly what my bishop was doing on f4 if I put it there. But the big thing it's doing is just preventing potential f4s, which is a huge deal. We see knight d5, and then I played knight h4, which felt pretty important. And this is what I mean. Now this move f4 comes, and this is a bit of a problem. So I played a pretty risky move here. I should have just taken on f4. I didn't do that, though. Instead, like how the position would probably go is something like bishop d8, bishop f3, queen h7, and then f5. And taking, for example, would actually just be a mistake. White's already actually much better here. But what you could do is just play c5 in this position. And but black requires quite a bit of accuracy here. So does white, of course. This position is a lot more promising for white, and I guess it's a little promising for black as well. But it's much better than the game continuation of bishop takes d5. At first I thought this was reasonable, but I thought there were some nuances I had to watch out for. The reason why I thought this could be interesting is because even though I'm getting rid of my light squared bishop, which is something that covers my king, is that after e takes d5 and g takes f4 is I'm able to take on f4, and I thought I was able to bring my queen over in time, at least just get sufficient defense. But this just isn't the case. I missed c5, and after c5 there's critical problems here. The long diagonal is getting opened when I don't have a light square bishop, so at this point I'm definitely lost. I think bishop takes d5 was the final nail in the coffin, but bishop g5 earlier was not helpful at all, and definitely cements my position from like being worse. So g takes f4, c5. I ended up taking on b5, and black took on d4. The problem is if I take on d4, they always have bishop b6, which could be very annoying. So that's something I wanted to avoid. There's always like ideas of like knight takes e5 as well. So like queen takes d4, we could also see something like knight takes e5 all of a sudden appear, where this does not look good at all. But of course, there's also ideas of bishop to b6 here, for example, as well, where the attack gets even more dangerous. So yeah, I took on a6 after they took on d4. I thought maybe this is an attempt to at least make things a bit messier. But now I'm really missing my light square bishop, and things don't really last much longer after this. So I played knight b4. We see queen g4 check, knight g2, and then rook g6. I ended up playing f3. I didn't really see any other choice here in the matter. The idea was essentially like knight h4 stuff was potentially in the air, at least like trying to add a few tricks. I don't even think it matters anyways, but that was at least an attempt here, because even if I got knight h4, it wouldn't matter. There's at least queen g3, and rook takes g5. There's probably even rook takes g5 here actually as well, which is a problem. But queen h3 was played instead, avoiding any of those tricks. I played queen f2, and then my opponent played d3, and this is where it's like it's clearly lost. I tried one more thing, but after my opponent's next move, I ended up resigning here. I played queen h4 because, well, if they take, then this is at least a little bit more promising for me. Now I'm threatening g6, and the game still goes on. This is really scary in the center. But of course they don't do that. They play bishop b6. And the problem here is that I'm just getting mated. I can't play king h1 or king h2 because their queen is there. And if I play king f1, then queen takes on f3 is a huge problem for me. And this will just end up, even if it doesn't mate me, it doesn't matter because I have to play king e1, and they at least get the knight here. And also they have mate, so they actually do have mate. My apologies. But yeah, that's kind of what I mean. This position was pretty bad, and it all kind of centered around the fact that I had very bad preparation with these Queen's Gambit accepted lines, which is a bit of a problem for me. So that was something of note for me to notice. I ended up playing the Queen's Gambit a few more times in this tournament. I think once or twice more. But this is actually the last tournament I decided to play it. After this tournament, well, I started going back to e4 just a tiny bit as well. But I was noticing a lot of lines that I was either not comfortable with, or I felt like there was even more preparation in these d4 lines than in e4. So I just wasn't happy with the way I was playing d4 when I was newer to chess, around 15, 1600. When I'm talking about online in this case here, in this tournament, I think it was 2100 on like chess.com. But when I was about 15, 1600, chess.com strength, I considered myself to enjoy positional games more, and I wanted to switch to d4, but I stuck with e4. And after finally playing d4 in a few tournament games and seeing how poorly it went, I think my mind has kind of changed that I do like positional games, but I don't think I like them in the way that I did before. And this tournament was actually a big proponent of me realizing this factor. So although I might play positionally sometimes, there's very few, or not few, but there's very specific positions in which I like to play positionally. Because we're going to see me play also later on in this tournament some games with black where I play positionally. Even ones recently in this year where I played like Semislav games, and they weren't inspiring, at least that inspiring. And that to me isn't such a great indicator of my enjoyment of certain openings or certain play styles. Is I want to be able to play interesting games. I don't want things to be too boring. Yeah, d4 is soon to be retired, and that's kind of it for this game. I hope it was at least interesting. I think there were some important points to mention, especially with needing to know more preparation around getting this pawn back, or at least getting compensation for it. And I will see you all in the next round where we play another game. So that's it. Have a good one. Bye-bye.